and welcome to the Collector's Edge from Nordic Art Partners. In this episode, we will discuss the work and career of Heinz Mack, a distinctive artist known for his pioneering contribution to the abstraction at the midpoint of the 20th centuries, for his founding of the Zero movement, and his innovative exploration of light and color. With me today is, as usual, our art expert Nicholas Robertson and me, your host, Jeppe Curth. Let's get started.
It is with Alex Rotter at 400 million. Selling here at Christie's, $400 million is the bid, and the piece is sold.
We've all heard about it. Sometimes it's front page news. Important works of art are being sold for incredible sums of money. But can you get involved and become a part of the exclusive club yourself? And how do you get started while avoiding buying the wrong things? That's exactly what this podcast is about. This is The Collector's Edge from Nordic Art Partners, a podcast for those of you interested in the mechanics of the art industry, want advice about putting money into art, or simply want to buy something for your walls to beautify your surroundings. Whatever your objectives, it is possible to put money into art wisely, to be considered, thoughtful, and well-informed in your choices and actions. Welcome to the art of collecting, with an eye for curated beauty and practical value.
Hi, Nick.
Hi, Jeppe.
How are you doing?
I am fine, thank you. You?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. Nicholas Robertson, a contemporary art expert with more than 25 years of experience. Nick has worked in London and was in New York for 20 years, and more recently in Copenhagen. He has worked in the auction industry and was a garagist in Manhattan for many years. For the last decade, he has focused on heavily research-based acquisitions for his family portfolio for private high net worth clients, family offices, and fine art investment funds. So today, Heinz Mack.
Yes, Heinz Mack.
Can we start by you walking us through Heinz Mack beginning in the art world and his background?
Yes, Heinz Mack is an interesting and in some ways a strange artist. He's one of these artists that you can mention his name to people and they will have something about him perhaps lurking in the recesses of their mind, but they can't really put a finger on who he is, what he does, what he's noted for. Almost like there's not a particular hook that they're able to hang his work on, at least in terms of what they associate him with. But Heinz Mack is truly one of the great pioneers of mid-century modernist art and thought, and had a really seminal role in the explosion of different kinds of experimental contemporary art practices in the post-war period. He was born in 1931 and is still working today. He studied at the Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf from 1950 until 1956. And then at the end of this period, along with his student, colleague, friend, Otto Piene, he formed a movement called the Zero movement, which was joined shortly thereafter by a slightly more celebrated artist, Günther Uecker.
Please elaborate a bit on that. What is the Zero movement?
Well, the Zero movement, it was a loosely knit group of artists that emerged in Germany, initially formed by Mack and Piene whilst they were students, and called Zero, rather like ground zero is the sort of epicenter of a bomb or an explosion. Zero was considered to be the starting point, a place of new beginnings. Otto Piene coined a phrase to describe it as a zone of silence and of pure possibilities for a new beginning. And he and Mack composed a poem that goes like this. 0 is silence. 0 is the beginning. 0 is round. 0 spins. 0 is the moon. The sun is 0. 0 is white. The desert 0. The sky above 0. The night. So obviously that's a very a very lyrical way of describing their objectives, and obviously, you know, you can have a chuckle at that. I think it's quite profound and quite beautiful. But some of the main themes were really, to begin with, monochrome, because really it was the purest departure from the expressive gestural art that had gained in primacy in both the European and North American artistic practices in the post-war period, and then further to the emphasis on the monochrome, the spatial effects of color, and how this main constituent component could be affected by things like light and vibration and movement. They also had a strong focus on collaborative happenings, events, installations, and many of the early cooperative exhibitions that the various artists were involved in involved self-curated group exhibitions, self-published catalogues, moving away from the cult of the artist as an individualist. So as their theories spread, the Zero movement was to become actually the most global art movement of the mid-20th century, ended up with active participants in many countries. So Heinz Mack was regarded amongst his peers as its leader, and the adherents included many of the great luminaries of this period, really legends of 20th century art. In France, notable participants were Yves Klein and Armand. In Switzerland, Jean Tinguely, the great kinetic sculptor. In Italy, Lucio Fontana, Piero Manzoni, Enrico Castellani, and even a group of artists in Japan that became very interested in these theories, especially Yayoi Kusama. So this, of course, is a sort of a who's who of the international avant-garde intelligentsia, with Mack at the epicenter as the founder and leader.
Thank you, Nick. Very interesting. So this Zero movement and these specific themes, how does Heinz Mack explore this in his works, and why do you think this resonates so powerful and well with the audience and the collectors?
Well, I mean, I think Heinz is really not as well known as his achievements deserve, and I think that's for a few reasons. One, his practice was extremely diverse. So he was known as a sculptor. He made various installations. He made works with unusual materials, modern and contemporary materials, different kinds of metals, acrylic, things that would enable light to be reflected and refracted in interesting ways. So he was very much interested in experimenting with the experiential effects of light and color. I mean, he would describe himself as a sculptor and a painter, but most of his work sort of begins as a painter. In fact, his first works from the late 1950s, 1957 really, they're monochromatic works that are predicated largely on an exploration of the grid. And, you know, they explore registers of light and dark and a sort of oscillating movement that results optically from their juxtaposition. So, you know, he's become associated with minimalist art that's sort of flowed from some of these explorations. He's been associated with kinetic art for the reasons I've just described. He's been associated with op art because of the sort of jangling vibrancy optically that his paintings have. So these are some of his achievements, or some of the sort of landmarks of his production, if you like.
Okay, and which of Heinz Mack's pieces would you consider like essential for understanding his impact?
He's had an extraordinarily long career. I mean, he was born in 1931 and he's still working today. He lives in Mönchengladbach in Germany and also in Ibiza, where he keeps a studio as well. But I would say his early paintings, his early black, white, grisaille paintings are beautiful. They're very graphic, but there's also, clearly the sort of hand of the artist in them. I think that his sculptural works made in the late 50s all the way through the 1970s, I mean, even till the present day, but I suppose the seminal examples, you can pick out a few different bodies of work from the various periods, but sculptures with the sort of interesting textural surfaces that enable different effects of light as it hits the surface. And then a group of works that really are the works that have captivated our interest and our attention are a recent body of works, by which I mean the last 20 years or so, that are called, in English, the chromatic constellations. And these are really both a distillation and a culmination of all of these areas of study that he's been involved with for the entirety of his career. The chromatic constellation, these are paintings on canvas, and they are also somewhat premised on the grid. And these consist of contiguous blocks of colour and sort of often quite strange colours, if I may say, sort of dissonant colours, or colours that would appear to be dissonant when arrayed alongside each other, but create very interesting colour harmonies. These blocks of colour, they're very sort of rigid and ordered from a distance, but then when you scrutinise the painting more closely, you see that these blocks are much more uneven, much more brushy, lots of washes of sort of dry colour built up in glazes. And then the edges of these blocks, they sort of overlap with each other. So you get these sort of intermediate tones where the colours of the two blocks are mixing together, and they have this very... they sort of hum a little bit, if that's not too strange a way to describe it. So you have this really interesting, sophisticated, very beautiful approach to abstraction and to studies of colour and light and how these various constituent elements interact with each other.
Well, we have bought Heinz Mack works for ourselves, but also when we advise clients about Heinz Mack work, how do you place him within this current market trends and historical context?
But his place in the market is very difficult to place, I have to say. And for me, for us, when we look at an artist, obviously we're trying to understand the value of an artist, and by that I mean the sort of innate value of their achievement, their contribution. We like to see how an artist fits into history, and not just where did they fit into history? It's like, did they actively influence history, and did they change the course of artistic production with the things that they were saying and doing? Obviously for the case of Heinz Mack, that is a very obviously resonant yes. So we can see that he's an artist of huge importance, and when we look at artists, we try and understand how they were received at this sort of inception of their career. What was the critical reception like? What was the institutional reception like? But this has been going on so long for Heinz that it's really much more pertinent to say what has he not done? What has he not achieved? And the answer is really nothing. He's been involved in seminal editions of Documenta. He represented Germany at the 1970 edition of the Venice Biennale. He's had 450 odd exhibitions worldwide since beginning of his career in the late 1950s. He's you ask what museums is he in? I mean, there are no museums he's not in. I mean, he's in more than 150 institutions worldwide. So there's a universal acclaim for Heinz Mack. And yet, to go back to my opening comments, there are so many responses that range from Heinz Mack to what did he do again? And I think it's incredibly interesting to try and investigate that sort of phenomenon.
Thank you, Nick. But what I also meant was, what part of Heinz Mack's works do you find most appealing to collectors when considering them for acquisition? Is it the visual? Is it the history? Is it the data? Or is it a mix of it?
Well, of course, it's a mix of all of those things. I mean, you can respond to something in a very visceral way. You can follow up on your curiosity and your enthusiasm, and you can verify the information that I've just described about his very obvious credentials. We take a look at the galleries that show the work. We try and understand what kind of availability is there, what kind of demand is there for the work, what kind of supply is there for the work. Heinz has really nice galleries. He works with Parra and Romero in Madrid, which is a wonderful gallery. He shows with Speroni Westwater in New York, and of course they need no introduction. He shows with Ben Brown in London, presumably in Hong Kong, where Ben also has exhibition spaces. He shows with Nara Rosler in Brazil, which also had a kind of interesting relationship with the Zero movement. So, he's well represented around the world with highly credible places that are very serious in the championing of their artists. We've got a lot of information that gives us a lot of faith that he's well looked after. But there's more to it than that. I mean, I don't always get too hung up on if there's lots of people clamoring for the work, if it's a highly inelastic supply and far too many people that want things. So sometimes the best things are hidden in plain sight, and there's just these strange historical accidents where the market has not really caught up to the art history, but invariably that's something that gets dismantled over time and changes. So if there's people not knocking down the door for Heinz Mack paintings, that's fine. That's good. That means there's more interesting things, at least in the meantime, for us to be able to look at and choose from and acquire.
Yes, that makes sense. I believe that his record auction result is $3.5 million for a large sculpture, and a large scale painting is around $900,000. Could you maybe share a little bit insight on the primary prices from galleries?
Sure. I mean, I think that the works that you mentioned must have been works from the late 1950s. I mean, all of Heinz Mack's very biggest prices relate to the beginning of his sort of influential period. The paintings that I mentioned, the chromatic constellation paintings, which I think are extremely interesting things to look into. They, for a modest size picture, maybe 50, 60 centimeters, you're looking at maybe $60,000 to $80,000. For a big 2.5, 3 meter painting, you're looking at $500,000 or $600,000 most likely. If you want to buy a historic painting from the late 1950s, then you can, depending on the size and the quality, important early works can be acquired for anywhere from $350,000, $400,000 euros up to a million, more or less. So this gives a bit of a guideline. There's some very nice works on paper from the late 1950s that aesthetically bear all the hallmarks that you would want, but the sort of hierarchy of the medium makes them pretty affordable. They can be anywhere from sort of $80,000 to $120,000, and they're extremely important historic works. And I think when you ask about sort of price, there's an artist's price relative to himself or herself, different periods of importance, different outputs they had made, which are maybe more or less popular and more or less expensive as a result. But I think we also really interested in, when we look at an artist, we look at the cost of an artist's work relative to the industry as a whole. How does an artist's price relate to the cost of the work of his or her peers? If we buy work by this artist, what is the opportunity cost of that? What are we not able to buy instead because we're committing resources to this artist? And I think for me, Heinz Mack's work is extremely, extremely affordable. And I think, there's a couple of really, really nice anecdotes about Heinz Mack and his early days that to me are very instructive about his relative importance. And these stories, they speak to his status and his reputation amongst his peers. And these stories were told to me actually by Guillermo in Madrid, who is an extremely eloquent advocate for Heinz's work. In any event, Heinz, I think in the late 1950s or maybe the very early 1960s, was traveling to Paris, and he was going to meet with Yves Klein. And when he visited Klein made a big sort of performative gesture of deference to Mack, the founder of Zero, and in Klein's view, this great master. So Klein gave up his bed so that Heinz Mack could sleep in it, and then Klein slept on the floor alongside as a sort of a gesture of subservience and respect. And the other fun story that I enjoyed very much, when Mack had his first exhibition, a lot of the works in it were sculptural works, and there was one piece that was sold. And this is, of course, not uncommon in an artist's the beginning of an artist's career, when nobody knows who they are or what they stand for or what they do, and you have to get a response and you have to get some momentum. A couple of years later, Mack was traveling to Italy, where he was going to visit Lucio Fontana. And so he goes into Fontana's studio, and on Fontana's workbench, he sees this sculpture. So he learns that his first ever patron, the first ever acquirer of Mack's work from a commercial context, was Lucio Fontana. So, I mean, you look at these two artists' work, and you see how sort of gigantic their reputation and the prices of their works, and you hark back to these anecdotes, and you think of the regard in which Mack was held by these guys, and then you see, what Heinz Mack's work costs in relation to their work, and rationally, it actually makes no sense. So of course, there's many contextual things that we take into account when we try and ascertain value, and of course, there's a big sliding scale of criteria by which we assess value.
Well, Nick, from putting money into art perspective, how do you see Heinz Mack's work fitting into a well-curated art collection?
I see Mack's work as sort of essential, definitive 20th century abstraction. I think that he is that key and that important. When you look at the development of art in the 20th century, in the 20th century is characterized by lots of different movements that all have very kind of complicated theories, justifications, philosophies that explain what they do and why. But one of the key things of the 20th century is the sort of dichotomy between figuration and abstraction. And if you look at the abstraction trajectory, abstraction is primarily about the constituent components of a painting. What is a painting? It's line and color and form of some description on a flat surface. And Mack was really sort of puritanically adherent to this, and he did it in really interesting, innovative ways. He made his first black and white paintings in 1957. And for contrast, it wasn't until 1959, fully 2 years later, that Frank Stella announced himself to the world in the Museum of Modern Art's 16 Americans exhibition. And it wasn't until 1960 that he exhibited works from this group in the first show at Castelli Gallery. These works represent the cornerstone of Stella's reputation, and he, I suppose, is considered the absolute sort of master for innovating this at the midpoint of the 20th century. Yet it could so readily be argued that it was Mack who'd already paved the way for such an achievement. So that's how key Mack is. And Mack, as a German artist studying at the Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf, he would have been well grounded in the sort of German intellectual color theorists of the earliest 20th century. I mean, if you look at the faculty at the Bauhaus and you see the lessons, the theories elucidated by Kandinsky and Paul Klee, and then you see, fast forward 80 years to painters like Stanley Whitney, for instance, whose work also costs millions of dollars in some instances. Heinz Mack is literally and figuratively the bridge between, these early sort of protagonists of color theory to artists working today that have become enormously celebrated in the market. So by any criteria, any historic criteria, any achievements, any critical appraisal achievements, Mack is a titan of the art world. And so, of course, it follows, as far as we're concerned, that at some point a proper reckoning will take place whereby he's properly appreciated in the way that his work deserves.
So adding Heinz Mack to your collection today would be a smart acquisition and also something that appreciate over time?
But my opinion is undoubtedly. My feeling is how can this not happen given what we know and what I've just described? But, even further to that, the paintings are extremely reasonably priced, and they are just sumptuous essays of light and color. And the purity of these works, the joy in these works, the quality of execution in these works. I mean, they're very rigid and programmatic, but there's also a great deal of levity and a great deal of expression also within the sort of rule-based confines of the way that he evolves his paintings. So I just find them to be just outstanding works unto themselves.
Okay, so could you maybe then summarize the key points to make a Heinz Mack work attractive addition to a collection?
Yes, I guess if we distill the things that we've learned and we've talked about, he's a historic figure, almost unrivaled if you sort of tick off the the CV achievements. He's actually going to have a retrospective, I believe, in 2025, beginning at the Philadelphia Art Museum, which is a fantastic museum, and that hopefully will bring a new audience and new sets of eyes to his work, and to give new appreciation to what he's managed to do. So that's his museological reputation, institutional reputation, critical reputation, fantastic. Still working, still exhibiting. A litany of great galleries around the world that represent the work. Sometimes we get excited by artists when it's clear that a revival is already underway and we feel maybe vindicated by our choices. But sometimes we get excited when no revival is underway, no rumblings of such, and it just feels opportune that it's sort of an open season for us to get involved in the work before it's too late.
Yes, and we are very happy with our acquisition of Mack works. But for people that maybe want to get started, where should they start exploring his works?
Well, I mean, his works are everywhere, even if you don't realize it. We were in a small museum in Aalborg in northern Jutland just a couple of weeks ago. And amongst all the local artists that, with all due respect, nobody anywhere has ever heard of, there were 3 or 4 Heinz Mack paintings, sort of strangely plonked in the middle of this mid-century section. So, I mean, you can go to any museum that has, that purports to have a survey of 20th century works, and you'll find his work. Obviously, there's many sources that one can look at online. I mentioned his galleries. They all have really nice biographical information, really nice images that show typical works of his. He has a website himself, which is a really nice historic archive as well. I believe the Zero art movement has a foundation, and so you can see more about his work there. Also, how his work relates to his peers globally from this very important period in the 20th century. It's not difficult to learn a lot about him, and in the course of doing so, it becomes astounding that he's not, in fact, a household name like basically all of his peers.
Thank you, Nick. So I think we are in the end of this episode. Do you have anything more to add?
No, I mean, that's my homage to Mack. I'm very passionate about his work, and I really, really urge people to go and take a look at it.
Great, thank you. And if you have any questions, or you maybe just want to buy some art, you can always catch us on our email at jeppe@nordicartpartners.com. And thank you, Nick, for this episode.
Thank
See you
you,
next time.
Jeppe. Yes, bye.
Bye.